Well, good evening, everyone. For those of you who I haven't had the pleasure to meet yet, my name is Sarah Turner, and I'm the director of the Paul Mellon Centre. And I want to extend a very warm welcome to all of those of you here in the lecture room at the Paul Mellon Centre in London, but also those of you joining us from around the world. And we have hundreds of people joining online, so it's always great to have these events where we connect as a community in the building online through our live stream feed. And obviously, I think our packed audience is testament to the reputation of our speaker, Professor Griselda Pollock, and also the interest in her new book. And here it is, I've got my treasured personal copy here, Woman in Art, Helen Rosenau's little book of 1944, and which the Paul Mellon Centre published at the end of last year. And all of us at the Centre are extremely proud to have published this book. And I hope it gives you all a very sure sign of the kinds of art histories we're interested in funding and publishing. And I think it represents a kind of art history which is challenging, it's complex, and it's creative, and presents us a new understanding of how art histories in Britain have been shaped and written. And indeed, and I was talking to Griselda about that before, it's really part of our thinking about the Centre going forward, as well as accounting in different ways about how intellectual histories have been written and shaped, how we archive those, how we collect them, and how we publish them. And I think the case of Helen Rosenau, a Jewish intellectual who fled Germany in the 1930s to London, and her pioneering feminist art history project has much to tell us about the cultural ferment of mid-20th century art historiography. And I think much of that history, however, has been swallowed up by more dominant narratives. And the careful task of recovering these traces has been painstakingly undertaken in this book by Griselda, with contributions from Adrian Rifkin and Rachel Dixon. And Griselda worked extremely closely with our publishing team here, because this is quite a complex publishing project in its own right, incorporating many of these layers and traces of history, and how you actually do that, how you make a book happen, I think it's really important to kind of celebrate and mark that moment. So I wanted to say as well, thank you to our senior editor, Emily Leeds, who I think is sat on the stairs, because she also had an important role into the final shaping of this book, as did the designer and the wider editorial team. And that, I think it's quite a unique publication, really, that not only incorporates Rosenau's text, republished with new illustrations alongside Griselda's chapters, that provide original insights into the text, but also, I think, do that bridging work between the concerns of 1944 and 2024. So as a result, a little book has become rather a big book, but I hope that Helen Rosenau would also be curious about what we've done and extremely proud. So I want to give the floor and as much time as possible to Griselda now for her talk. So many of you will be familiar with her biography. I'm not going to read it all out in full, but say to consult our website for more details about the book project and Griselda's career. And after the talk, we'll have time for a Q&A session, also time to celebrate and toast the book over a reception, and I think this is the result of many lifetimes of work. So without further ado, please will you all join me in welcoming Griselda Pollock to the Paul Mellon Centre.
Okay, back to little people down here. Okay, so I just get shorter and shorter. I don't know if this is happening to other people over the age of 70. You suddenly find your coat is going along the ground. So I'll stand up tall. Anyway, thank you very, very much. It's an incredible honor to be speaking here. 4 years ago, I came with a proposal, like most proposals, it was rough and excited and all the rest of it, but it was welcomed by those at the Mellon and has been crafted in every physical as well as intellectual way by the incredible pleasure or the work of the editorial team, the directorships, Mark Hallett and obviously Sarah Turner, and I want to thank them to start off with making this possible. I also want to welcome today Helen Rosenau's son, Helen Rosenau's daughter-in-law, and Helen Rosenau's grandson, who are very kindly with us. And of course, it's a very emotional moment when your mum-in-law or your mum or your grandma suddenly becomes the object of such a serious and weighty process of things, etc. But indeed, they have her own copy with us. So I want to welcome you and thank you enormously for the support you gave me during the writing of this, sharing your archive with me, and we went through things and learned a great deal more to give the sort of substance of someone who had encountered Helen Rosenau. So my thanks are to everybody, and we'll see this. So we're going to set off on our journey. So the first question for everybody is, who was Helen Rosenau? So she's not just any old thing. She's an art historian, which was quite an achievement in a sense in the beginning of the 20th century, born in 1900. She's an archaeologist. She is a social historian of art, which means she's definitely aware of materialism and on that order of the things, which see how that matters to us. She was also an architectural art historian. She's a feminist thinker of a generation that we forget to understand, that between the emancipation struggle and the 1968 are swathes of continuous intellectual and political and feminist activity by women. But she's also one of the pioneering Jewish studies scholars. So she's quite an interesting figure to look at and put together. Also such a stylish dresser. I had to find this. We didn't find this photograph for the book, but I put it up. I know she would have been a woman after my own heart. But being very serious about it, now suddenly we put aside fashion, she was offering us a feminist sociology of knowledge which stands up against phallocentric positivism. You're immediately entranced now because you all think, what the hell is that? We'll find out, but I mean, you'll see what positivism is. It's somebody who doesn't actually think that you need to think at all about things. You just need to look at things and tell it as it is. But she also recreated for me in art history as an investigation of symbolic form. Now, this was another great puzzle to me because I had not come across this philosophical proposition. I'm now terribly skilled at knowing about symbolic form, but that will come to. But she's also not only, therefore, a philosophical art historian, but one who's working as a sort of in the notion of social historical transformation. So she's not thinking that art floats high above the world. It's deeply rooted in social processes. So how do you put that all together and make that work? So we look at the publication. She's got a great long list of articles, but not that huge number of books. But if you said, how could this give you a portrait of the intellect? You'd say, oh, she's a medievalist and she looks on Christian buildings. The only monograph ever written in England up to 1948 on Jacques-Louis David, so she writes about revolutionary French artists. She's obviously interested seriously in architecture, 3 books here. And here's the Catholic cathedrals of Cologne and indeed Bremen. And here's the last book she wrote, which is The Vision of the Temple, the image of the temple in Jerusalem and Judaism and Christianity in 1979. So what on earth is this book doing amongst the others? And how does it relate to the only other book she wrote, apart from the Jacques-Louis David, in the 1940s, which is A Short History of Jewish Art, which opens us into this emerging field of Jewish studies. So this is what I have to begin to explain to you. Now, Helen Rosenau was born very exotically in Monaco, in Monte Carlo, because her father was a physician, a doctor who ran a spa. Where else to run a spa? But Monte Carlo, go to Monte. And then they left and went to Bad Kissingen. Obviously, in German, Bad is a spa. So she grew up in a spa town. Very elegant, as you can see. And we're going to jump now to 1982, when she writes to somebody, and we have this fraction given by Mike and Louise. I wonder whether you have ever heard of my little book, which is where we get the title from, which was published by Isomorph in 1943. Yes, it came out in November 43, so we are matching the 40-year anniversary, or the 80-year anniversary, which was published by Isomorph. My title is Woman in Art, and it immediately sold out. Lucky thing. I mean, I've always had a sold-out book. And it immediately sold out. My friends urged me to have it republished, perhaps with a postface or a new edition. Would you be at all interested? Now, we do not know who Madame was, but clearly we are answering that finally now. Here is her own copy inscribed, photographs provided by Michael and Louise here. So I wonder if she was suddenly inspired by the fact that all through the 1970s she witnessed book after book after book after book after book being published about women artists, from why have there been no great women artists, to our hidden heritage, to women artists, to women artists, to women in art, history of painters. And maybe she said, well, maybe this is the moment people will like to republish my book. Now, in Britain, the only books that came out in the 70s about this was Germaine Greer's horrible book, The Obstacle Race, in which she says there could never have been great women artists because their egos were so damaged by patriarchy that they could never achieve anything. So it's a sort of social pathology of women's damaged egos. So we're not too fond of that one, because it competed with, of course, mine, because you can put aside things. But our book, Rosie Parker's and my book, Old Mistresses, Women, Art and Ideology, which, getting a little closer to Rosenau's title, was actually finished in 1979, although it took a rather long time to get published. The other book that's probably not on your agenda is, in fact, a very interesting French book, Françoise Daubonne, who is the founder of feminist ecology. She wrote already about ecological issues in 1970s, but she wrote the Histoire de l'art, les luttes des sexes, so the history of art and gender struggle, as a reply to Nikos Hadjilau's History of Art and Class Struggle, which came out in 1973. But in 1977, she gave an answer to it, which is already way ahead of anything that my lot ever came up with, but it's going to be republished in France soon. So here is a later picture of Helen Rosenau, and she was a feminist since the 1920s, went to a lecture, I'll tell you about that. She was an art historian trained in Hamburg, which is a very serious place to be trained as an art historian, and she became a lecturer and senior lecturer at the University of Manchester from 1951 till her retirement in 1970, but she still continued working and teaching in London thereafter. But you'll see there's a gap between 1930, when she finishes her PhD, and 51, when she gets a post, right? And it's that gap of being an exiled emigration, a refugee in Britain, trying to find a place in the academic world. And you'll see that she's part of a group who didn't find it, compared to all those knighted, glorious men who did. But we'll talk about that shortly. Okay, so I want to go back to the 79, which is a missed encounter. I'm sure not everybody's recognizing who's here. That was Griselda Pollock in 1972. I was a feminist since 1966. I've been a feminist activist since 1970. I was a PhD student, finishing my PhD very belatedly in 1980. And I too was a lecturer at the University of Manchester, but missed her, and nobody ever told me that she had been there before me. It's kind of very serious. And although I'm retired, I'm still working, obviously. But the most uncanny coincidence is caused by this. I showed you the last book she wrote, The Vision of the Temple, which was published by Robert Oresko, who had founded his own imprint. He was a student of Wittkower, who was another of the German Jewish refugees who came to Britain, and he was an architectural historian. So this is perhaps how the link came. But he also, Robert Oresko, commissioned me as a graduate student to write my first two books, on the basis of which I eventually got my job at Leeds, because it's good to have publications. They didn't probably look at them very much, but he also commissioned Old Mistresses. So these two books, the manuscripts for these two books, lay side by side on his desk. And I find that very poignant, sometimes even more teary moving, but crucially interesting about the end of one academic life and the beginning of another, but I never knew about her. And that's what I'm kind of interested in, is how could one generation emerge but never know that there was one before? So let's go back to 1940 to 44, the years in which Dr. Helen Rosenau wrote this book. She did not write it at the Courtauld, but she wrote it at the London School of Economics. Why? Well, because of Professor Karl Mannheim, who was another refugee from the University of Frankfurt, who was her supervisor. And he enabled her to write this feminist and socio-historical analysis of woman as a symbolic form analyzed through images. Now, so we're not going to be talking about women. We're not talking about women artists. We're talking about an idea. And to be a symbolic form is it's something that is thought, it's abstract, it's not the real thing, it's the abstract idea of something, and we have to work out what woman is the abstract idea of. It's not just the name of persons who might either be born like or choose to be considered women. It was sold out, it's an independent publisher, so we need to think about this. Very interesting formally. A paperback in 1944, a mere 8 years after the first paperbacks came out, plastic and ring-bound, reasonably priced. I've rechanged the site. I think it's more like £10 than £25. But on the cover is this very interesting, now very well-known figure. It's not a Venus, I called it a Willendorf figure, which you can see here how tiny it is. It's 11 centimeters, so this is not a monumental piece of sculpture, but it was only excavated in 1908, which means this idea that something like this was made 33,000 years ago, or before the Common Era, is a phenomenon of the early 20th century. So this is a very crucial thing, which is not, it is very old, but its knowledge, its presence in our knowledge resources is part of the early modernist period. And this is the back of the book, and notice it's an academic book because it has Helen Rosenau, Dr. Phil, PhD, because she had not only a PhD from Hamburg, she had an incomplete second PhD, which is required in Germany to teach in a university. You have to have two, which was interrupted in the University of Bonn, and then she did a third at the University of London at the Courtauld. So she was one of the very first people to do a PhD at the Courtauld, founded in 1932. Right? And this is number 1 of the Isomorph series, lots of others planned. None of them ever happened because wartime publishing was not a good time to launch something. And it was produced by a man called Anthony Frosshag, who introduced Bauhaus design to Britain in terms of book publishing, and he's a very important figure. And if you're interested, this wonderful book by Robin Kinross documents the whole project of this transnational exchange between Bauhaus modernism and him. So we've got a really interesting little book, and this cover combination is again crucial because she's not talking about a lineage from 33,000 years before the Common Era to a work by a contemporary sculptor. She's laying them side by side, and this, I find this little photograph of 1932, just as Barbara Hepworth is trying to move beyond figuration into something that's going to be more symbolic or abstract. Here we have a figure of woman produced by the kind of modernist sculpture that's being inspired by the discoveries of these pre-classical, non-Western works. So brilliantly, with the designers, we've come up with a way to recreate that cover. But you can see 1944, 100 pages, 55 illustrations, black and white. 2024, 388 pages, £35, 139 illustrations, thanks to the Holberg Prize. Thank you very much. This is what paid for it, all illustrated in colour. So we now move, I hope, to my second question. Why is there a big book about her little book? This seems a little out of keeping. So what's in the big book contents? This is why you have to see this. This little grey stripe is the original, beautifully packaged inside this unbelievably heavy book. And that's what we've done with colour. So it's got a new bibliography and it's also in full colour. A new part 1 with Adrian Rivkin, a personal memoir, because he is her student and was mentored by her. And he's the one who said to me, casually, about 10 years ago, don't forget the little book by Helen Rosenau. And I thought, difficult to forget a book I didn't know about. I better just smile sweetly and find it, which I could do then on the internet, and discover, to my horror, how a whole feminist career had gone by without knowing it. The second person is with the wonderful Rachel Dixon from the Ben-Uri Gallery, who's here, who wrote a very, very important article tracing literally the experience and the documents that document her experience as a refugee scholar in England. I personally never use the word émigré because émigrés are voluntary. You decide, don't like the French Revolution, I'll off and go to some other place in Europe. These are refugees. These are people who were in fear of their lives and had lost their livelihoods. So this is a very important thing, and we've discovered some very important things I'll mention later by Helen. And then I've done an intellectual portrait of Helen Rosenau using a little chapter of the book where she uses Rodin's figure of la pensée, of thought, which is carved from Camille Claudel, but how she, just as a reading of just this passage of how she uses this idea to enable us to have a portrait. And then, as some of you will know, that I'm given to writing a lot. So I then did a reading of the book in 7 essays, but they're short little, so you don't wait down. You can do one a night if you want, okay? And that's quite this. So this is how it got long. So I analysed the cover and the title, the foreword and the preface, the plates and the method, the process and its feminist context. I formulated a bibliography and analysed it. I then read the chapters to try and make sense. What kind of feminist art history is this that she's producing and how? And then I put it in the context of the kind of intellectual formations of the contemporary between women's time, feminism's time, art's time, and Jewish time, to try and see all these different temporalities that the work instance. And then there's some personal afterthoughts. Now, I'll put the question again, why did I write a big book now about her little book of 1944? Just a small few questions for you to think about. But that's really the heart of it. This does require us to rethink what you have been taught as the formation of art history, what has been left out, and what it means for the ways in which I think the present moment of people talking about what feminism and feminist art histories is being seriously misunderstood because of a missing sense of its already having a place in the debates about what art history is and why this is happening in terms of Britain. So let me speed up a little bit. So these are questions that we have to, how is it that a book could become so invisible in 30 years? Why was its memory lost by the time we were compelled to pose the question of women art again in the 1970s? And what did I, or shall we learn by reconsidering this book in the conditions of its emergence and in the context of becoming compelled to think about it and to think with it? So it's not just recovering missing feminist memories, which was the title of what I lectured on in 2014, but that this is a damning critique of the barefaced sexism of art historiography, let alone of the art historical profession in Britain by 1970. And there is no two ways about this. This is not anything that we can kind of juggle with. It's actually a political and ideological project that happened. Now, this is all the more shocking because Helen Rosenau has the most impressive art historical credentials of anybody. She starts her studies with Heinrich Wölfflin. Now, any of you who are art historians will know he's Mr. Big, right? He's absolutely the founder of a major intellectual form, even though people like to kick this out and say, we don't want to go formalism. We are nowhere without formalism. This is one of the most important series. You can see it's really principles of art history, serious work. And she studied art history for 20 years, and then she studies with these amazing medievalists, somewhat less famous in terms of general, Paul Clement, Adolf Goldschmidt, and in fact the first woman to be a professor of classical art history in Germany, Margarete Bieber, who was in Britain, another refugee in Britain, in 33-34. She has a DPhil from Hamburg, a DPhil from Bremen, and when she goes to Hamburg, she's studying with the very, very, very young Owen Panofsky, who has just got his first professorship, who was also a student of Goldschmidt and Bieber as medievalists. We have to bring in Dora Moss-Panofsky. She did marry Panofsky and lost her own identity for a moment, etc. But she's an art historian. She's in Hamburg. And, of course, Arvi Warburg. So she's in the hottest place to be studying art history in the middle of the 1920s. And she does a PhD on architecture. But so she's not looking at a Werflinian style of architecture. She's digging into the absolute base. Now, Cologne Cathedral I think, begins in the 4th century, right? And then it takes until the 19th century finally to get its spires. But she's down in the basement saying, what is the conceptual idea that is planted by the layout that you can start with? Because, as you can see, this is an Andrew cross. If you go into most cathedrals, you've got the other crosses, not the Greek cross, etc. So you've got a long transept and then the cross, but this is mid-cross. So this is very interesting. She gets her PhD because she's doing it with Panofsky, who was also an architectural art historian, who in 24 wrote this unreadable book called Perspective as Symbolic Form. Well, I'm sure some of you have read it and teach it with confidence and understand what he was talking about, but so that's very important because he himself was doing medieval architecture and doing this model. She then goes to Bremen, and here she is on the corner, leading an archaeological dig, again under this other cathedral for her habilitation thesis. And they're remarkable. These are such extraordinary buildings, but she's down in the sort of 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th century crypt trying to work out where they first made the structures before they got layered and layered and layered. So she's pretty good. So I'm going to reinstate her. Here's this picture from Emily Levine's Dream World, Land of Humanists, Warburg, Cassira, Panofsky, and the Hamburg School. Well, I'm sorry, the banker has to go. And we're going to put her in there. And on the left is Ernst Cassira, who wrote The Philosophy of Symbolic Form. Arvi Warburg, who produced the idea of the Builder Atlas, Owen Panofsky, who writes Perspective. And so now we are going to put her there. So that's what I think, first thing I've done, is to try and get this to understand that women art historians are part of art history's theoretical and methodological pantheon. Now, to justify that, we have to look at the book. So you're going to look at this list and say, wives and lovers, motherhood, and further aspects of creativeness. Oh, how disappointing. Your hopes were raised. But if we understand woman as a symbolic form it's an attempt to give a form to something so you can think it. And what you think when you think woman are the social relations of kinship, which is what Claude Lévi-Strauss will come up with, which involves the legal relationship of marriage. So you have to put aside all your anxieties about who's going to have civil partnerships or get married or not. This is it's a universal institution for the exchange of goods. You exchange children one way and you get goods back, right? That's all it is. So if you're going to have children to exchange, you've got to have legal control over the product of what happens when men and women have sex. They may produce children which are then, oh, okay, you can have my child and I'll have your camels, right? And this is the fundamental Levi-Straussian notion of what kinship does. But there are also erotic relations of desire. Now, there's lots of forms of desire, right? But in this particular case, woman articulates certain institutionalized erotic relations of desire, and therefore institutionalized non-institutionalized the other kinds of relationships that are excluded from these legal, theological and sociological things. There are the passions of the body, there are social roles within a certain division of labor in an institution, there's the issue of generational change, And also, as we get towards modernity, woman articulates a struggle for creativity and agency. So once you have those in mind, you can go and look at art, because you say, how does it articulate not a woman or women or images of women and images of men, but these constituting relations that produce linguistically the terms of the exchange, or the terms of the system, or the terms of the ways of thinking, bodies, desires, eroticism, generation, and agency. Okay, so I'll just move on here. So I just tend to interrupt this because we need to go back to two things to get woman in art in context, which involves the politics of the moment it's written. So 44 is the moment it's written. So that means Helen Rosenau escapes from Germany when her, because of one of the first laws that the Third Reich passed, or even before the Third Reich, the National Socialists, when they're passed, is to deprive all Jewish people of the right to an employment in any government. So you have to go somewhere else to even be able to live. So she comes to London and tries to obviously get into the British academic world by writing a thesis on the history, not of cathedrals, but of the synagogue. Now, this is a little obvious. Okay, I could hide behind being a Christian medievalist, even though I'm Jewish, but no, she's going to do it on the architectural form. And this is because this amazing synagogue was excavated in 1932. So it's another thing that surfaces right in this period. And although everybody will write the books about Clark Hopkins, I just want to remind you that it was excavated by two people, Clark Hopkins and Susan Hopkins, who both excavated this synagogue. Now, why is this interesting? Is because, as you know, and I'm sure you've been reading recently as you've been marching in the streets, about Titus, 28 to 81 CE, who was a Roman emperor who in the Jewish-Roman War captured Jerusalem, destroyed the Second Temple, and exiled all Jews from Jerusalem. Never allowed to come back into Jerusalem. And he brought the treasures in triumph to Rome. So if you've been watching your whichever Raiders of the Lost Ark or whatever it is, there's a whole lot to think. They still think these treasures are somewhere in the catacombs of Rome. And here they are being brought back to Rome, and here they are on the walls of Europa. So this is what I call the Nachleben of the Jerusalem temple, which will eventually produce her book about this idea, not of the going down under the cathedrals, but to understand this formula, this architectural formula of the temple as something that persists and gets reincorporated and rewritten. But at the same time, she's writing this when most of the synagogues in Germany were destroyed on pogrom night, Reichspogrom night, 9th to 11th of November. This is a synagogue she knew well. This is what it was left like. So my argument is that her turn to Jewish studies was a defiance of Third Reich fascism. And as we've sort of discovered, in a sense, this wonderful discovery that we've made, you've made, sorry, that Helen Rosenau's name was in the Black Book for the Jews who would be arrested if Germany conquered Britain, as everybody thought it was going to in 1940. So she's writing about the synagogue on the cusp of potential destruction. So I think, was her feminist study of women in art also an anti-fascist, socialist feminist, Jewish defiance of the Third Reich? So I want to put these in relationship to each other as a crucial element. Okay, let's go. Okay. Third question, was her woman in art, therefore, as an piece of art history, in some way a response to this key idea that Warburg put forward in Hamburg, which is that we study art as images which are carriers of not symbolic meaning, but pathos. They're the carriers of certain kinds of affective states, which are articulated through gestures and certain compositions. And that's what means the Nachleben is the continuous life of certain ways of formulating these unformulable things like ecstasy or anger or desire or rage or violence into formulas that persist and recur when people wish to articulate that. So this is what a lecture would look like, Warburg, which rather looks not unlike a good PowerPoint, actually, when this is how he laid it out. So recently they reconstructed the whole thing, and you could see this grand scale, this tracing of the persistence of certain formula of these violence, death. So my experiment was to put all the images together from her book and see whether I could see this. So we go back to wives and lovers, motherhood, and further forms of creativity. What would happen if you looked at the illustrations, the images she chooses, as pathos formulae, these formulations of certain states of mind or emotions, etc., but of kinship, desire, and the law, that would be the couple, of generation, affect, and life, which would be the parental child, what we call motherhood. There's no proof of fatherhood, so you can't have a pathos formula of fatherhood in the same way you can of motherhood. And then, in the modern times, of singularity and agency. How do you start erupting out of the sociological and cultural structures of that kind? So I don't think it is purely that, but I think it's a very interesting exercise. Then a fourth question, why did I compile a bibliography by author, by date of publication, and subject area? Because it reveals what sources that she was building on, which then itself reveals the persistent engagement in 19th and early 20th century anthropology with the question of kinship, of these double relations, the lateral relationship between adults and the vertical relationship between generations. And these are cross-cultural, these are anthropologists studying the almost universal incidence of societies having ways of organizing that. And they're all different, but they start to begin. So it is crucial because it denies 19th century scientific arguments of scientific or biological basis for difference. They are all constructed, but it's not constructed sociologically, it's actually symbolically constructed to articulate meaning. I also found out then how many subject areas, how much psychoanalysis was that, how much sociology was in there, how much philosophy was in there, how much literature was in there, not a lot of art history, they're not writing very interesting things, and also how many women. How much of these major developments in anthropology, sociology, and the rest in the 19th, 20th century were equally being produced by men and women. Two crucial that you need to understand. One is Gertrude Kinnel-Simmel. Some of you will know of who Georg Simmel is, but Gertrude Kinnel-Simmel was an artist, studied in Paris, showed in the Berliner Kunstausstellung, then married Georg Simmel, and they co-created an intellectual circle with Mariana and Max Weber. Any of you have done Sociology 101, it'll be Marx, Weber, Durkheim, and Talcott Parsons. These, again, miss out her, and Rainer Maria Rilke, Reinhold and Sabine Lepsius. She's the painter on the right here. She joined the women's movement, she moved into philosophy, and she published under a name. And what is her book? Reality and Legal Regulation in Sexual Life. So absolutely spot on for this chapter. She is joined by Marianne Weber, and this is hardly a photograph, a painting of a great intellectual. So you'll see, I don't think we'll see in a minute. But I lined up, there's a whole series of these incredible women, including Jane Harrison, who are absolutely changing all these sociological, anthropological, classical feelings. Now, this is much fiercer. This is a serious intellectual look if you cut out the pretty dress. These are her books from 1906 to 1948. Occupation and Marriage, Wife and Mother and the Development of Law, The Question of Divorce, Authority and Autonomy in Marriage, On the Valuation of Housework, Women and Culture, Women and Love, The Fulfilled Life. So this seems to me a crucial way of being able to read with whom is Helen Rosenau in conversation. Once we put her back into the categories established in the feminist sociologies of Simmel and Marianne Weber, we know she went to hear Gertrude Simmel lecture. So she's the bearer of this into this book. Now, if we read the text, I'm just going to move on a little faster. and you can read about the preface, but we're going to find that she's mobilizing a sociology of knowledge as a social history of art. She's mobilizing anthropology. She's mobilizing, we can get there, I thought maybe this goes more slowly, the idea of not women as having inherent characters, but as social and psychological beings. Now that's really crucial for our contemporary ways of thinking, because we either have feminists engaging in questions of subjectivity and psychoanalysis, or we have the sociological trend, but you don't hold these two together. And that's, I think, what she dares to do. Why this is important is because she was working with Karl Mannheim. And this was the great revelation for me, because if you go to any sociological community, they say, oh, yes, you know, art history, no, we have no knowledge. But he is in debate, in conversation, I'm going to jump on this a bit further, with our friend, okay, no, I'm going to have to do this slow, with Owen Panofsky, because they are all reading art history in order to work out this question of how you take social systems, but also imagine mentalities, right? How do we understand how people thought about the social systems or articulated the social systems they're living in? That's partly what we do as art historians. We take the things that people paint or make or build, but then we try to say they are the product of social systems, but they're not caused or determined by them. They do something specific, which is to give a symbolic form to a livement. But it happens through a certain kind of formal process, but also through a mentality. And this is what the sociology of knowledge is. Knowledge is just I'm thinking, and because it comes out of my brain, it's all out of me, or it's just pure thought. It's sociological, and it's sociological because your thought can either be the status quo that you think within the frames, or your thought can be imaginative and then transformative. So his major books are The Sociology of Knowledge and The Ideology and Utopia, i.e., how do you have a kind of repeative and obscuring thought, or how do you theorize something that is potential transformation? And what that needs is time, which is then his other major thing, is the theory of generations. Because what makes one generation think differently from another generation? Okay, so when you're doing history of art, they say, oh, in the early Renaissance they thought like this, and then they thought like this, and then we come to the Baroque and they think like this. And you just trace the symptoms of this, but you don't understand why that change happened, right? Why there's a Caravaggio after Michelangelo is that there's some inspiration, but they are completely different structures, pictorially and symbolically. And this is where we find, from Jas Elsner, that Mannheim and Panofsky were in conversation about this. And indeed, very famous thing if you're taught iconography is that iconography is where Panofsky talks about what's the meaning of tipping your hat, right? But the original anecdote is Mannheim's anecdote when he has a little story about how to understand different kinds of mentalities and actions as ethical and political, and it's about somebody giving money to a beggar. And it's not just the gesture, it's actually the mentality of the person who makes the gesture. And he says this man was selfish because he wanted me to be impressed that he'd given money. It wasn't about the charity. So we have this really interesting linking of the art historical conversation with these people who are precisely the ones in which she's doing. On the other hand, we have another side of Mannheim, the only other person doing a feminist project at LSE side by side with Helen Rosenau, and I must move on because you're going to want your drink soon, is Viola Klein, who was another refugee from the Czech Republic, a Jewish refugee from the Czech Republic, and she is doing a project with him called The History of an Ideology, the Feminine Character. So what she's doing is mobilizing this book to analyze the writings of the major figures at the end of the 19th and earlier 20th century who are theorizing what we will call woman as symbolic form or this condition. So you've got Havelock Ellis, Otto Weininger, Sigmund Freud, the Wertings, I mean, some of you will know this, Margaret Mead, and she is analyzing all the different ways these people are trying to think these concepts precisely, or think, as it were, these two sets of relationships, right? The lateral relationships and the generational relationship, which we might call sex and gender, and analyzing where they are ideological, i.e. containing themselves in something that will be fixed, and where they are transformative, giving us a way out of the fixed visions of what we think of the patriarchal. And that lies side by side with Simone de Beauvoir. So we've got to put Helen Rosenau now in a feminist genealogy as well as an art historical genealogy, because that is exactly what Simone de Beauvoir was researching more or less at the same time, using the same terms of reading myth, reading history, reading literature to see how people had formulated these key ideas. And in 1949, she published this first chapter on looking at psychoanalysis, looking at the surrealists, looking at, the Marxists. How did they explain this question? Because she's trying to talk about not, a different side of this thinking of woman. She's analyzing the myth. So she's, in Mannheim's terms, analyzing the ideology of gender, right? And what she says is this ideology of what she's calling a myth is fixed. It's like a static myth projecting into a Platonic heaven, a reality grasped through experience or conceptualized from experience, i.e. we live it or we try to grasp out of experience some way of gripping it, and it transposes this diversity for fact, value, and empirical law. It substitutes a transcendent idea, timeless, immutable, necessary. Now, I don't need to press this, but of course the eternal feminine, this notion of woman, in this late 19th, early 20th century thing she's analyzing, this becomes an absolute truth. So thus, to the dispersed, contingent, multiple existence of women, mythic thinking, which is her term, opposes the eternal feminine, unique and fixed, so that if anything happens that contradicts it, when women behave and say, I've got a brain or I don't want to do this, women are failing to be proper women. We all know this. But once we put these together, I don't want to go into that anymore. But Mannheim is interesting because he's the first person to teach the sociology of gender at the University of Frankfurt in the 1930s. That was a surprise to me. One of his many PhDs was Giselle Freund, the great photographer that some of you know. And this is Emily, if you're still there, Emily, one of her great pieces of page setting where she created this juxtaposition, which I thought was a lovely little queer moment in this whole thing about Adrienne Monnier photographing her lover, Giselle Freund, looking across at Virginia Woolf. And of course, I have this fantasy that Mannheim, Rosenau, Giselle Freund, and Virginia Woolf had a dinner party and met in 1939. Okay, so I'm going to finish. So what do we learn by reading this? Now, that's too much for you, so I'm going to tell you have to read the book now. But I'm just going to show you how wonderful it is when you start looking at images in this way, because you're not looking for who made them. You're not ignoring when they were made, but you're not tying them to that type. But you're seeing this diversity of inscriptions of these fundamental social, legal, theological relationships we call marriage or love or eroticism. And here you've got Etruscan marriage, funerary marriage. You've got one in the British Museum of the formation of this idea of what is marriage with these taking of the right hand, which those of you know the Van Eyck painting, you'll know that happens again. You've got Orpheus and Eurydice about the loss of the love. You've got humor. You've got political intellectuals working together. You've got scientific intellectuals. You've got sociologists. How do you figure a couple of intellectual equals? How do you figure scientists? How do you figure thought? How do you figure politics? This becomes an interesting thing. How do you figure power? Again, and this one also, the question of intellect. And some of these are more varied. As we move to how inadequate this kind of representation is of women thinkers to some of the more interesting 20th century photographers, most of whom were queer, who were doing these amazing images of women intellectuals. Come on, move forwards. How do you think about women as revolutionaries? How do you think about women as anthropologists, sociologists, a suffragette and composer like Ethel Smies? How do you do cross-cultural analysis of the different societies? And one of the things I found so interesting in this book was to discover how many of the German Jewish refugees became major scholars looking at African art. Particularly there's Eva Meyeritz, who became a major figure documenting and was indeed made a queen in Ghana for her work in relation to her very long study of Ashanti, of art in the particular areas, different areas, and lived there for many years. There's Stella Cramrish, who's a very important figure, who became the first professor of Indian art, appointed by the Indians in Calcutta in 1924. And, of course, political diversity in terms of things. The inscriptions of what we call motherhood, if we call it generational relationship, whether you're looking at Hathor amongst the Egyptians, Artemis, or Diana of Ephesus, in late classical things, Celtic images of the Northern European peoples of the Matronae, the Catholic vision of this very strange thing of the opening Virgin, right the way through to Angelica Kaufmann as another Greek story, etc., but through to these different instances of motherhood, some violated, some bereaved, some the elective affinity of step-mothering, what kind of mothering happens without bearing children. So these are completely expanding our vocabulary. Self-articulation is a creative subject, and I have to make one more thing about this. So look at these images. There are women in her book, in particular, and we'll see where they come from. There's a lot of women artists in her book in 1944. Some of these images come from one of the publications that came when Phaidon came to London. So these are the women artists who are documented in the 500 self-portraits that, and we find them occurring, if I lighten them up, in her book. She looks to China, she looks to medieval art, she's looking at the different ways that religious law impacts. The Goya is about divorce. This indecipherable image is either an unhappy couple or a woman with her client, but she loves this picture of working class love. This is how she describes the Picasso there. Now, you can see how you can start to write a long book asking your questions, and I want to just come to this one. Because if you start with the Willendorf figure 33,000 years ago, you think, oh, there's, it continues, it's continuous, it's discontinuous, it's diverse, it's complex, it requires all the skills of an art historian to read all these images. Which is a work that was made in 1937. So this is Barbara Hepworth in the 1930s, kind of classicizing, primitivizing a little bit in the kind of terms that we shouldn't be using. I should never have used that word, but borrowing from a number of different, more formalist traditions outside of the European tradition. But this is the great breakthrough, and it's exhibited in 1937, and it's the same idea. How do you represent singularity of something which isn't phallic? Right? So everything is interesting to do with how you have a rising form, how you have a form of a certain kind of fullness of the form that doesn't require us to have the sort of specificity of the breasts and the vagina as you have in the other. So this work was, I said, only excavated in 1908. So the modern work is part of this moment where the back history of art is being broken through by excavations in the late 19th, early 20th century, which carbon dating will emerge in the late 19th century, early 20th century to enable people to confirm something that breaks out of the Western Eurocentric, Christianocentric, classical-ocentric vision of what the history of art is. And the modernists are, of course, challenging that. But the type to personality, type is a philosophical term used in the symbolic form philosophies, but personality is the registration that history has changed the typologies. Right? This is the radicalization, and one of the things that all the sociologists that she's drawing on, all the anthropologists, is what happens when modernization unsettles everything. And out of that, of course, will come the women's movements of the 19th century, the 1798 through to the 1898 through to the 1970s, that we're all in that part of that process. So I want to just finish, if it will go forward, is when we end the story of Schifrin with these works, it's not about the art historical explanation of how you go from figuration to abstraction, but how you could read these as a formulation in the Warburgian sense of a formulation of a certain pathos, the pathos of individualism, or the pathos of the two-ness, the duality, or how you could imagine this as symbolic aesthetic works in pre-classical art that now become intelligible in terms other than the Werflinian story of art. And you ask yourself, how do you figure singularity or relationality? And that depends upon this relationship between what was found before, the pre-classical that is discovered. Now, this is where I'm going to finish, because we have to bring these two things in. Within 6 years of her publication, this book arrived. From a young man with no credentials, much, wandering around the Warburg, got commissioned by Phaidon. His only reason to be commissioned was he'd written an art history book for children. And this is the most infantile book ever written. Conservative, positivist, but so destructive, because he says there's no such thing as art, there are only artists. And you've probably read that sentence so many times, but that is the killer, because everything I've talked to you about so far is about art. This is women in art. It's a completely different understanding of art that does not require us to have heroes, monographs, biographies, oh, the suffering, oh, the anguish, oh, the stories of all of these things. Now, this book, of course, is not a story of art, but a story of artists. But it's devastating. It's sold 8 million copies. It's in 30 languages. There is no one on this planet who has ever studied art history who has not been contaminated by this book. Right? Artist women in this book, 0 in all of those editions, except Kate Kollwitz in a German edition. They conceded. Now, look at Phaidon, Donatello, Da Vinci, Van Gogh. This is the beginning of an art history of artists. And this has trapped women, feminists, into writing books about artists. We can find them again. We can have this exhibition in Madrid. We can have this another one in America, in Baltimore. We can have great women artists. We can, until I can't be bothered to buy any more. We've got them, and then we will get the most obscene book. And this is so serious. I mean, this is not a joke, because this book is the story of artists without men or feminists. We all know that. And it's taken me a long time to say, I will stand up and say this. This is complete exposure of someone taking over the kind of whole 70s work of recovery. But why has it won all these awards that has never been awarded to any of the brilliant books by Linda? I'm sure Linda's probably deserves them more than any of these things. But I mean, why is this? We are in this situation. But it's because of that moment of the 1950s. I used to think it's just the beginning of the 20th century, but we can now date the contest between the kind of art history that Rosenau brought to Britain and elaborated in this little book with this particular phenomenon. And I see this is why it matters that we understand the difference between monographic art history, which ultimately now serves the market. It's a brand. and artists are being trained to have a brand, to sell themselves by a practice, as opposed to this great philosophical study of what art is as an attempt to think and formulate these structural relations. Okay? So why did British culture adopt and reward the conservative patriarchal scholars? I recommend you read Perry Anderson, who analyzes this moment in who came to Britain, who stayed in Britain, who left in Britain, who was ignored by Britain, because the British hate synthetic orders of thought. Right? They love positivists. You begin to do this, and I'm sure you're thinking, this is not about art. She's all talking about theory. I don't want to read anthropology. God knows what Cassirer is talking about, symbolic forms. Well, I'm sorry. You can join the conservatives. You know, you can be part of a distinct instinctive aversion to the very category of totality, of thinking systems, right? And when we look at what happened, who came to Britain, who was rewarded? So there is a white migration. Sir Ernst Gombrich, Sir Karl Popper, Sir Louis Namier, Sir Isaiah Berlin, Sir Nicolaus Pevsner, who are all anti-theoretical positivists, who never got a decent job. The Red Migration. Isaac Deutscher was ignored by the establishment. Frederick Antal struggled never to get possible job. Arnold Nowak also got a job briefly in my university in Leeds. Helen Rosenau waited almost 30 years to get a post and was never respected by the people in Manchester from the research that I've done. So this is a crucial thing for people to understand and to take back into their teaching. What was the effect of this precise moment, and why did it disappear? So when Wollheim talks about the group of German-speaking scholars like, sorry, I have to say this one. Okay, here. Pevsner, Saxel, Johannes Wilder, Edgar Wind, Rudolf Wittgewer. You've all probably heard of them, right? If you're anybody in any historiography, you know about them. And they brought to Britain the intellectual sophistication. They forced it to come of age. But in that category, there are no women. Not a single woman intellectual is. Whereas, here's just a few of them he could have mentioned. Not all of them come to Britain, but Eva Meyerowitz, who is the one I mentioned, Stella Kramrisch, I've mentioned, Erika Tietze-Konrad, Margarete Bieber, George. These are all available figures who are part of this emigration that have changed the history of art. And I am pretty sure, and this is why I'm so passionate about it, that come a few years down the line, I and my generation will be as untaught, as unforgotten in the introductory courses of the history of art. There will be, you can do a feminist course, you can do some feminist stuff, but we will not be integrated into the history of the intellectual history of art history. So my final point was, how can I show transgeneration feminist fidelity? And I finally, in the book, saw a correspondence between Julia Kristeva, who's been a guiding light in my work, about the idea of temporalities of generations, and this idea of this hinge between bodies and meaning, between passion and the sign. These are exactly the same things articulated through psychoanalysis and literary theory, but also instead of a sociology of knowledge, or beside it, there is also, we need Foucault, we need an archaeology of knowledge. We need this critical understanding of the formation of the discourses, the rules of formation. So women's time is we can explain it a bit more, but when Michel Foucault says archaeology is a comparative analysis that's not intended to reduce the diversity of discourses and to outline the unity that totalizes them, but to divide up their diversity into different figures. Now that is crucial for us trying to not end up with a thing that I do a bit of queer art history, or I do post-colonial, or I have to decolonize, or maybe I do gender, or maybe I do women. These figures are the figures of the absolutely compacted sets of social constructions. So we have class, race, gender, sexuality. We've broken them up, but if we see them as entangled figures, which are articulated all the time in different ways in the works of art, often with exclusions, often with foregrounds, we have the purpose of not having a unifying but a diversifying effect, but not in this now labeling. We must get away from this identity categories. We have to have a form of understanding these structural, which is why I use Edouard Glissant's word. I don't like intersectionality, but the entanglement, which requires consistent decipherment, but we decipher it through art, because art is already enacting these or formulating them in different ways. So on that basis, I wish to thank you for your incredible patience and attention. And on its 80th anniversary, I am so thrilled to say that the Mellon said yes. I'm very sorry, I've left you no time to argue with me, so you want your drink, but...
We can have polite questions here and arguments over drinks, and Chris. But I think we'll have some time for some conversation now, because there's so much so, and I love that idea of entanglement, because entanglement across forms, across generations, and doing that work, actually, I was just thinking as we're sat here in Bloomsbury as well, the social spaces in which these ideas are shaped in institutions, through publishing and publishing houses, and actually the work of taking a book and seeing it, not just the work of a sole author, but as a crucible of intellectual shape and intellectual history. I felt a kind of opening up as we were leafing through its pages, but each page contains a kind of deep sort of dendrochronology or archaeology. I like those metaphors of digging deep and rising up. So that just for me, I felt as we were watching and listening with you, we were kind of doing that deep work of excavation.
Well, it was very much like that, because Adrian Richmond kept saying to me, just get on with it, just finish this book, how can it take, 10 years to think about it or 5 years to write it? And you think, I didn't understand it, because nothing in my art history background, even in terms of my feminist background, gave me the tools to see what this 19th century and early 20th century thing was. So some people who know me, and particularly Francesco from working with you, this moment where the people who weren't included in the Warburg Circle began to be interested in Warburg, right? And there's this wonderful thing about, Adrian writes about the difference between working in the Warburg and working in the Verburg, this how the translation of this thing that with these changes, etc. But nothing when I was at the Courtauld would have made me go to the Warburg Institute. It didn't make any sense, because we were being brought up in a completely formalist, educated in that particular model. And then slowly I've done it myself like a kind of autodidact, running along behind people thinking, have I quite got it? Do I quite understand this? And then when I'm at Cassira, I thought, oh no, I'm going to lie down on my, bedroom floor and say, I can't do this, Adrian, I don't understand. He said, sorry, just get on with it. But that work has been so rewarding to see exactly that archaeology of trying to plot out. And I know other people can do more with this or plot out in a different way. But my main thing was to not just have her as a curiosity, right? But that moment when I decided to put her in that dreamland of humanists, I thought, that's it. We've got to insert women's thinking into this normalized pantheon. And if we can't shift that, people will keep repeating it, and women will always be additional, not co-creators of these intellectual debates and indeed contesters, or adding new concepts.
Yeah, and I think also for your talk as well, it made me think about what's happened, the losses of the professionalization of art history, perhaps losing something of this porosity, these intellectual conversations with sociologists, and somehow perhaps in a kind of a professionalization and a defining something that we can sell to students to come and study with us, or to kind of protect it and create it. We've lost something of the kind of messy porosity and dialogue which happens in that sort of that intellectual ferment that you were kind of, for me, mapping out.
But that's also the crucial thing about understanding which Jas Elsner's work, and I'm sorry, moment loss of the other co-author with him, but it was in the PowerPoint, that Mannheim was reading Riegel, and I thought, one of my colleagues keeps teaching Riegel, and I thought, oh God, one of these old men that I don't know about, and I thought, oh Lord, another big lacuna. Okay, so why is one of the great art historians at the founding of art history writing this book about late Roman art with this concept of the Weltanschauung? Why do we find consistencies across all sorts of material forms in a culture, from its highest form to its lowest form of throwaway pottery, sharing something, right? Now that's the thing. So we can't just say it's all the style, because that was the Werfling, it's a bit thin. Oh, they all have the style and they copied. That's where you need something more than a mentality. So the first thing that Mannheim writes is a critique of Riegel, because they're all reading the art historians. So it's not a kind of messy porosity, excuse me saying that, it's an intellectual transdisciplinarity, because you have to think society, you have to think the text, you have to think the image, you have to think the subject, you have to think how thinking thinks, you have to think how images formulate, and you can't do art history if you don't teach people that they are going to have to engage with this. If you narrow history down, you are only going to serve the market, or the people who, the only thing you can collect is an object or a name. They can't collect what the work that art does.
I can already see some questions, so I'm going to just hand my mic here to Lynn.
Oh,
Okay.
Lynn, hello.
Griselda, thank you so much, and congratulations to you and to everyone at the PMC on a really stunning book. I mean, on every level and in every sense of the word, it's stunning. But it's left me in a real mess.
Oh dear.
Because I'm full of what ifs. You know, what if that tradition of the sort of hermeneutics of the image, the historical and sociological, anthropological hermeneutics of the image, had been the one that won out? Where would history of art be, or where would art history be now? Which left me thinking, are you saying that the social history of art, as it took shape in Britain and America and elsewhere in Europe, has that been complicit as well in just kind of, you know, burying a kind of theoretical, philosophical tradition of thinking about the image that can also be political? So, my first, that's a question, and then an observation is how important it is to say again and again that this was happening before 1970. Although there are great histories of post-1970, and of course Women in Revolt is a brilliant example of that, the exhibition at Tate Britain. It was happening before, and we shouldn't occlude those histories, because it's not a prehistory. It's not pre-feminism or proto-feminism. Exactly. It's feminism. So, I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm still thinking a lot, but thank you so much. I think it's a brilliant book.
Thank you, Lynn, very much. But I'm going to stand up. I'm going to say this because you're sitting down and things. I just say two things relatively quickly about that, which is, yes, to the social history of art is complicit, right, in some degree and not degree. So I'm a social historian of art, and the continuity would lie in what the social history of that 90s, what I gained, for instance, very simply, like what I gained from reading T.J. Clarke, is it made me read the 18th Brumaire and then read Marx. So I could get hold of this other sociological, this tradition, and historical. So you can't, I can't do without that, and to some extent, Rosenau doesn't do without it. She's formally, because she's not sort of post-situationist Marxist like the social history of art of Tag and Clark and Hadji Nicolau were, sorry, a dyslexic person with a Greek name, as I'm very apologetic for that one being marked. So, but of course, it was experienced by those of us in the 1970s of the kind of condescension. So I got condescension one part from Alan Burness, you know, you're wasting a perfectly adequate intelligence on a trivial subject like women. On the other hand, you couldn't get gender and sexuality, and any more than you could get issues of race and post-colonial, into the mix, because Marxism is a totalizer. So the anti-totalists, totalists hate Marxism, but the Marxists are totalists. They're not going to share the space. They give a certain kind of prioritization because this is a single explanation. And that's where this anthropology, this tradition of anthropology, of thinking symbolic structures with the new different kinds of sociology, but also, in a sense, getting back the sense that they were, at the beginning of the 20th century, many of them were aware of other worlds and other histories and other timelines. And that's why I keep stressing this archaeological thing, this surfacing that's shattering the classical Christian-centric Western timeline. And also, obviously, you know, the Jewish question of the Jewish timeline, that comes all sort of into it. So I think there is a complicity. I do think we were closed out. And then you get labeled feminist. And that, I think, has been the trap, because, so that's one thing. The second one that you're saying, which is, yes, the great revelation for me was to find a continuous body of feminist thinking, which took the form, so let's take Billington Greig as an example. She's a suffragette with the Pankhurst. She thinks violence is not the answer. By the 1940s and 50s, she's on a range of committees. She's talking about how can you foster the notion of revolt. To pick up your women in revolt. Revolt isn't just resistance, etc., which is this, you know, upheaval and transformation. So by the 50s, 40s, she says, we've got to get women into parliament. We've got the vote, but they're doing nothing, right? But we've got to get women into parliament as women, not because they're tick box MF, but because they're thinking the question. And there's a thing at a conference I talk about where these women get together. So there's, you know, Dame Mary Stocks. There's a whole range of these really important mid-20th century thinkers saying, what is it that we could say to people that having more women doing things could do for people? So they investigate, are women less criminal? So they get all the statistics. Do women commit less crimes? So because we're much less violent, okay? Doesn't support it, but she goes through all the things, and one of the things they conclude is you've got to teach everybody literature and art by women. You've got to put in front of everybody examples of women scientists and philosophers and all the rest of it. That's going to be changed, because not because we're arguing there is a feminine character or something in femininity, but there is a historical body of stuff that, if you encounter it, will change the way people think. Because it's not presenting women artists, because that's why I absolutely think you're just going to have exhibitions going on for years. Oh, we've rediscovered them again in a whole other, like the Maestras exhibition. The director at the Tyson, who's a lovely man, he's very positive, and the feminists love him. He says, "Oh, I'm so thrilled. There's so many names I've never heard about." And I say, I think we wrote about this half a century ago. You've had 50 bloody years, excuse me, absolutely saying to people, excuse me, you could begin to think about that and do an exhibition more interestingly. Then here's some more of them, right? And here's some more of them, and they do motherhood, and they do sisterhood, and they do something else. What are they doing when, you know, my interesting thing, which is, you know, what is happening when Artemisia Gentileschi says, oh, this interesting thing that Caravaggio did to a subject that everybody's talking about. What is that doing? How would you read it? Because you're reading these people in conversation with each other, and in terms of the Counter-Reformation and what's happening in the early 16th century, 17th century, which is the great era of colonialization, beginning of colonialization. And you've got to hold those together. And you can't do that under a name. and do I like her, and was she good? You know, was she interesting? It's what it did. How are you going to read it? So I think what we got from the 70s, which is I'm reaching back to, you know, Foucault and semiotics, which was the form in which that was thought in the 70s, compared to symbolic form and anthropology in the 20s and 30s. And I'm more interested in the sense that I constantly get people saying, even the book before this, you know, no one will read it because they don't know the theory. And they don't know the theory because nobody says to students, I'm afraid you're just going to have to read a little bit and try it out. And you have to know about how meaning is produced. You have to know what subjectivity is. You have to know this. But now we're trying to, you know, teach how to decolonize without any understanding of what colonization is as a system, as a discourse, as a power structure, as a negation of subjectivity, as the formation of certain subjectivities. So I use all those words, and I thought, you know, I'm sure the students think, I don't know what she's talking about. I know, but how, so that becomes this very pedagogical thing, and I think we are now at this anti-synthetic, anti-totalizing, anti-structural thinking, the power of positivism in British, you know, way, is the thing that we had this tremble in the 70s of an intense theorization process. And it's now something that we, you know, as you say, the professionalization, and they take the women artists in, but they don't take anything else with it, right? And it's harder and harder for me ever to write anything because, you know, I'm just now thinking, you know, I can write the books I want to write, and if I find some publishers who are prepared to do it, but that's good, but I'm just depositing something there that maybe in 50 years somebody will say, oh, that was interesting. How did they think? I don't understand how they put that together. But we have to take this on board because otherwise we're drifting into, you know, as you all know in university, we don't know what it is to teach anybody, and we're terrified to teach anything that will cause offense. I mean, excuse me, this is so ... awful what has happened in the history of the world. We do need to make people feel desperately unhappy, more so than they are at the prospect of Trump as the President of the United States, which is just... Anyway.
Look, well, maybe there's one question there, and then maybe we'll continue. Yeah, and then we'll make sure. I'm sorry,
Thank you very much. You've really opened my eyes to an enormous knowledge about my mother that I never had. But one of the things that her holistic perspective you haven't really mentioned is her interest in aesthetics. And I wonder if you think that that made a significant difference in her perspective.
Yes, thank you very much. There are two things. In one sense, when you ask that, the interest in aesthetics, there is this whole aesthetic theory, obviously. What is it? What gives us pleasure when we look at art? And I don't think she's asking those questions in this book. And in one sense, her interest is more in how what we call visual structures, whether it's a cathedral or a temple or the synagogue, are the ways in which we give a form to certain things. So that's why I've been stressing this idea of a form or a formulation. The question of traditional aesthetics is what is the beautiful and what is the nature of the kind of pleasure I get from looking at it. I don't think she is particularly interested in that, but of course, anybody who writes about anything in art, you are constantly up against the incredible ways in which those formulations or that thinking takes its material form, right? And I've been challenged to write about Matisse, and I can never got Missy's. I have to feel so ignorant. I never got it. But by setting myself out to do that, I have begun to sort of, you get to that point, you say, just you kind of groan with these. How did that happen? How did he do that? So I think all of us get that, and we wouldn't study art history in any way unless this equally fascinated us in a sense. And an exhibition I did recently was called Medium and Memory, which was trying to hold these two ideas in that there's something that someone feels they need to make art about, that needs to have a form, but it only happens because of the way in which their skill, their capacity to compose, their use of materials, the production of a thing, an effect happens. So I think it's a really important point you've brought up. I think she loved it, right, and was interested, but she was also deeply intellectually interested in what so in the Ideal City book and in her books on architecture, what made people want to imagine something other than the real world, make a city beautiful or produce a sort of an ideal. So that's an important thing. Thank you for raising that, Mike.
I want to give us time to have conversation, to look at the book as well. I think we have copies on display next door. So I hope you'll all be able to stay around, to have a drink, to ask Griselda any questions, and to kind of process all these amazing ideas about the intellectual histories and the shape of art history, what was and what might have been, and ponder on that. But before we kind of break and go into a more informal session over drinks, I want to thank you all for coming to be part of this conversation, both in the room and online, but also to say thank you so much to Griselda for your collaboration with us. All the conversations that have shaped this book have been a real joy and a creative endeavour for us, which is not only about making a book, but again, these bigger questions about what is it we're doing in publishing and supporting something called at the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art, and thinking about the shape of the history of art in Britain in what I hope is a complex, creative and challenging way that's in conversation with you and everyone in this room, and particularly Helen Rosenau. So let's say thank you to Griselda, and then we'll go next door.